All right, welcome back, everybody, to another. This is our third installment of a sermon extra. It's a new experiment we're trying, see if it's a good idea. Feedback has been good on our previous episode. So we're just talking about some things that come up, some auxiliary things. I don't mean auxiliary in the sense that they're not important, just some things can't be talked about all the time. So important things sometimes don't get the full treatment on a Sunday. And it's just good to have leaders of the church have some conversations that might be helpful to others, how we as elders and leaders of the church think through this. So pastors and elders are going to be joining me for a conversation. Rob Witham is back with me today for another of these episodes. And so Rob and I are going to be talking about Acts chapter 5 and the story of Ananias and Sapphira. This was the most recent sermon I preached. I think, Rob, you were actually in our kids ministry today, so you didn't hear my sermon, but still, it's a passage that you're familiar with. It's a hard passage if you're not familiar with it. Briefly, the version of the story I could tell is that in the early church, they were sharing things in common. They had this propensity to sell their possessions and give to those who were in need. It was kind of a tight-knit community, and in that context, the couple Ananias and Sapphira took advantage of that gracious atmosphere to also try to deceive man and God. Peter, in that passage, who confronts them, says, "You're not lying to man, you're lying to God," because what they do is they sell a property, they keep back some of the proceeds, but act like they are giving all of the proceeds to the church. And so I thought that this story is just rife with things that we could talk about, right? Mm-hmm. But I read and preached on both the context of the passage and the passage itself, which is that there's this whole idea of sharing. We have the positive example of Barnabas, his first mention in the Bible. Joseph, who's called Barnabas by the apostles, sells his land, and he's kind of the positive example, and then Ananias and Sapphira become the negative example. So I thought we could talk about, Rob, for just a minute, both this idea of Christian sharing and selling possessions. There's a lot of discussion in the book of Acts. Does Acts tell us exactly what to do with should we be trying to emulate everything that Acts tells us? Or does it give us a historical picture only? And the nuanced answer to that is we got to dive into that and talk about that, right? Mm-hmm. Because there are some things that are prescriptive in the Bible that tell us exactly what kind of character we should have, exactly what we should do. And there are other things that are historical events that are described for us. We don't repeat the crucifixion of Christ. Mm-hmm. We learn about the crucifixion of Christ, but we do learn to die to ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. We do take up our cross. So there's a nuanced kind of approach to that. So if you're game, let's dive into to this idea. So I'll put it to you like this. There's this idea of sharing. Some people say their alarm bells are going off, Christian communism, this idea that the early church, they didn't have people say personal property. They had one common pot. And what would be your understanding, just like if somebody was coming to you and saying, like, "Hey, I'm struggling with this. Does this mean I need to sell everything?" Mm-hmm. Is that what God requires of me? Mm-hmm. What would be kind of your counsel to them?
Yeah. I think this is an example of where having the entire Bible inform your view on it is really important instead of one descriptive passage, right? So our understanding of the way we read the Bible is that you have things that are prescriptive and things that are descriptive, meaning passages that tell you exactly what to do.
That's prescriptive, right?
Like
prescriptive
prescribing, this is how you live, is what you do. And then you have things that are descriptive, which describe an event, which is more the nature of this. Mm-hmm. That's not to say it's not presented in a way that's intended to show that it was beautiful, which I think it is. It's not just telling you, somebody walked on the road. It's presenting a picture of something that I think the implication scripturally is that it was good. However, if you take the entire Bible in terms of what it talks about provision for people and how that's to work out, you'd be hard pressed to really, especially reading through the Old Testament and the Psalms, and then in the Proverbs, and then into the New Covenant, 1 Timothy 5, a man who won't provide for his family is worse than an unbeliever. The general sort of thrust of Scripture is that provision is to happen through the home, through the family unit. That's who's given the job of providing for the needs of family. of children of those who are without, whether it be widows or orphans. It's primarily given to those, to families to do that. I think that's the general rule all through Old and New Testament that we find. This is an example of potentially like a situation where maybe it was necessary. We don't know exactly why they did this. Was it a new thing? Were these families already kind of doing some of this? We don't really know. It also was something that they volitionally participated in. It wasn't something like the governing authorities told them they had to do at threat of penalty or of death or something, which is where we would have problems with things like, hard socialism or communism, is that it's sort of forced charity. It's like, do this or else, and it's a form of theft. This appears to be totally volitional as people gathering together, so you're free to share that which God has given you with others. There's nothing in the Bible that says you can't do that. You are also required to provide for your own family in a way that's distinct from your friend's family, right? Like there's some distinctions there, but that doesn't mean you can't share or be generous. So that'd be my general kind of way to view this.
Some really good threads to pull out of that. I think, R. Kent Hughes is a biblical scholar and pastor. He said that the difference between, the idea of Christian communism and the Christian ideal of sharing is that communism says what's yours is everyone's. So in other words, there is no yours. It's by definition everyone's, right?
Yes.
Christianity says what's mine can be yours, right? There is the sense of ownership. What God has given to us, that's stewardship. That's, as you mentioned, this throughout the Bible. He gives to his people certain things. He gives them land.
The eighth commandment assumes that the persons can own property that is only theirs. Otherwise, what's stealing?
But what the heart does with that can go in multiple different directions, right? So provision is a direction you can go in. Charity and exuberant, abundant giving is another direction. So what I think is this passage describes what can happen when the gospel grips our hearts, right? So a number of other things can happen too. You could be called to be a missionary to Africa when your heart's gripped by grace. You could be, but it would be wrong of you to turn around and say, now everybody's called to be a missionary to Africa, right?
Yeah.
It could be the case that you start a school because God has laid on your heart, to start a school, but it would be wrong for you to say everyone should start a school.
Yeah.
So, this is a beautiful example. We shouldn't say this is like bad or like they were naive or something like that.
That would be not being faithful to the text.
No, the text presents it as like, look what amazing thing happens when the gospel grips people's hearts. But to form a rule on that would then be a step further. And of course, I say of course, but sometimes it takes explaining. The passage itself tells us that they didn't have to do it.
Yes.
Because when Peter condemns Ananias later, he very clearly says to him, was not this property yours? Did you not have the right to sell it and keep the property? Like you had all these rights,
Great
right?
point. Yep.
So the issue was the deception. The issue was not either owning the property or selling the property or keeping the proceeds. That was not the issue. The issue was presenting that you had sold it for so much and then lying to God about the actual amount. So let's move and talk about that because this is a hard passage in the New Testament for sure. It's, if you don't know the story, Ananias and Sapphira's lives are required of them. God takes their life as judgment on their deception. That raises questions for people. One of the first questions I think people think is, this sounds like an Old Testament story, right? God does this in the Old Testament. I mentioned on Sunday, this is a parallel story to the story of Achan in the Bible, where Achan deceives and it's triumphant. It's the Battle of Jericho is going so well. We're going to get this land in no time. God's promised it. And then all of a sudden this story halts everything. Achan has stolen something. And when God had commanded to destroy the spoils, and it just halts their narrative, and his life is required, his family's life is required. It's taken away, and the story is like, okay, we better not be casual with God, right? That's kind of this is a New Testament parallel, and I think people wonder, like, I thought God in the Old Testament was the judging God, and God in the New Testament is the non-judging God. So, what do you say to that kind of general thesis?
I think it's not right. So
What's wrong with it?
There's so many different angles. Like if we start with Christ, the way he presented himself, he said, if you want to know what the Father's like, look at me. So Jesus came. And so if we want to pit Jesus against the Father, Jesus tells us we can't do that. He said to know him is to see the Father. And so, we see Jesus often primarily as compassionate, as gentle and meek, and he certainly had those traits. He also certainly has a fire of judgment and is presented to us later on, both in Revelation, particularly in Revelation, as the resurrected King of judgment. Who's ruling and reigning. And so we need to know God in all his fullness, which is that he loves sinners. He is patient with us. He is the one who gave himself for us, and also the one who is wrathful against sin. And so there's no God of the Old Testament, God of the New Testament. It's easier maybe to do that at a surface reading, because in the Old Testament, there's a lot more narratives about his judgment than there are in the New. But I think our calling is to have a wise view of the entire Bible that synthesizes all those things together through Christ and how he presents everything.
I think we sometimes forget that the Old Testament was a lot longer time period too than the New Testament covers, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't like God on every page, God is requiring lives of people either. It's like centuries, millennia.
Lots of patience in there, yeah.
So I do think we need to say theologically, 2 Peter tells us, God is not slow, as some count slowness, but he's patient with everyone, not wishing anyone to perish. So the fact that God does not judge us, is a function of his patience and his care and love, which also assumes another theological category, which is that God has a right to do this, and we have a deserving of sin, of death, right? Yes. Which is not something that everybody shares, right? So I think part what I mentioned on Sunday was that we can really have two different kinds of discomfort with this story.
Yeah.
The one kind of discomfort is what I would call a wrong discomfort, which is that God is being too severe here.
Yeah.
What's behind that? What do you think is behind that kind of feeling that this is God, jumping off, or like losing his patience, or like, just kind of going too far,
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's a few different ways I think you could answer that. I think, in terms of principle, it's not wrong for God to kill anyone, right? So God is presented, the Apostle Paul presents him as the potter, and we are his clay. The clay may not say to the potter, why are you doing this? No, God owns us. He made us. He may give life, and he may take it in a way that is distinct from what humans may do, because we're creatures. We're not the creator. So, and that's not to say that God is like fickle or, doesn't have a reason for what he does, but at a basic
perspective.
Level, I think Orthodox Christians need to accept that God is within his purview as God to do such things and judge whenever he pleases to do so. And the fact that he doesn't do it to all of us is a sign of his grace, as you said, his great grace, like any sin that we have done. So maybe it's also partially just a low view of sin and of God's holiness, which I think is a big problem in the church. The reason people have problems with the Old Testament often is that there's so much judgment they see, which I think is a low view of God and his holiness. If you don't understand why God would be angry about sin, it's not a flaw in his character. It actually establishes him as a white hot holy God who cares about that which is right. So I think that's one way to come at it. We don't know everything in this story. Again, we're not given all the info about what exactly was going on. There was something about that situation. Maybe potentially there was an example being set there, maybe, or something too, to put the fear of God in people. I don't know. Yeah. There's lots of different things.
Certainly, great fear comes upon the whole assembly because of this.
Like, this is very serious. We don't do this. We don't lie to God. And I think it is scary because we've all lied to God.
Yeah,
we've all done that.
Well, that's the second discomfort that I think is the right kind of discomfort, right? Which is, and that's what the early church did. They didn't say, "Oh yeah, Ananias and Sapphira, how terrible were they?" Mm-hmm. Great fear came upon everyone because of this, because they also realized that maybe I had some thought to do that. Like, right. When we slow down and say, I have tried to deceive God. I have presumed upon his grace. Yeah. I have made myself appear more spiritual than than I am to other people, which is what Ananias and Sapphira did. And God does have a right to take and judge that, take life. It's a separate question whether this is eternal judgment or not. Certainly, I don't know if you know this, but St. Augustine believed that this was a temporal judgment, not an eternal judgment, which is an interesting. And many conservative scholars have thought that, and we can't know that for sure because we don't know the hearts of Ananias and Sapphira. We're not given that information. We're just maybe they were young Christians. Maybe they didn't really understand. Like, surely they understood the deception, but they may not have understood the wrath of God, to this extent. And so we can't really say anything about their eternal character, just in the same way that God requires the life of Moses, to not enter the promised land. He takes his life before he goes into the promised land. But Moses was God's priest and his beloved son. So we're not making final judgments about Ananias and Sapphira, but we are saying that life itself is something that's God's. And I think the general principle is too, just because God does show mercy does not mean he must always show mercy in every circumstance. It's kind of like the principle of, like, if you're speeding on the highway with 10 other cars and you're the one who gets pulled over, it's not unjust that the policeman pulled you over and not the other ones. It is, now he showed mercy, right? And maybe, I shared on Sunday actually that I got pulled over. I shared as an illustration, and you know about that because you and I were in a meeting together. I was late for our meeting because I got pulled over for expired plates, and I was shown mercy. I didn't know the plates were expired. I didn't get any notification, but it is my responsibility. So he showed me mercy. The cop did. He didn't write me a ticket. But he would have been well within his rights to write me a ticket, and it would not be right for me to say, "How dare you?" It would have been right for me to then pay that ticket, the cost of the wrongdoing, even done in ignorance or done lightly. The penalty is still true. It has nothing to do with my intentions. So we don't know the intentions of Ananias and Sapphira. We don't know, but we do know that God had this right to do this, but he often doesn't. That's the amazing thing. That's what, you don't walk away from the speeding ticket example and say to your kids, like, so sometimes you're unlucky. Sometimes you'll get pulled over in life. So just keep speeding, and sometimes you get off, sometimes you won't. What you say to them is, so don't speed on the highway, right? Because that's the lesson you take from it, not that God is fickle and he might get you. You take the fact that don't be casual with God, right?
Don't test his kindness.
That's right. So God's judgments are just. And I think we've got to say that whenever they happen, on this side of life, on the other side, we're his, as you mentioned, we're his clay.
I think being willing to look at those hard passages and say that is really important to being, like, to use our word from the previous, to being an authentic Christian. It's like, I think when Christians are afraid of those passages and shy away, it doesn't give anyone great confidence. It's like, but if we really believe what we say we do about God and who he is and presents himself as hard as some of those things are, and we have compassion, and we understand as humans, there's a human level to his judgment. We may not fault God for those things. He is the owner. He is the creator. And if we really believe that, we've got to be able to say, yes, Lord, your judgments are true. The psalmist says that, like, I love your judgments. They are right and they're good. And sometimes they're terrible, but that is the nature of living in a sinful world.
That's right. And if you're listening to this, you're alive, you're in his world, and he has not shown you judgment, and so whether you know him, then you give thanksgiving. If you don't know him, then you turn to him and you say, I have been casual with you, and I desire your mercy. And the scriptures say that whenever we ask for that, he's faithful and just to do that. He gives us his mercy. So
amen to that.
So great fear can follow on us from the passage, but then what do we do with that fear? It's like we turn to the Lord, and we recognize, I have trampled under your grace, but I know that it's extended for me. And so one of the things I said on Sunday is, there is grace for those who have presumed on grace.
Yes.
which is all of us,
Yes.
right? So if we're alive and our heart's beating and, we're listening to this, then God is ready to receive our confession of how we've trampled on that grace and ready to give us more grace, abundant grace that we don't deserve.
Yes. Amen.
Thanks, Rob.
Yep. Thank you.
So we'll end the conversation now, but thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks again for listening. To access more resources for your walk with Christ, please visit us at ascensionphx.org.